Did that work?
Yep.
Yep.
You're shaking your head.
Hello.
Hello, now I can hear you. Yay.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I just left another meeting about 2 minutes ago. I'm super excited I'm on time.
Oh,
Okay.
I know that
So,
vibe.
so surprise, we're live right now, but we'll get started here in like 2 to 3 minutes. But
I love it.
we've
Surprise,
been
we're live right now.
we've been sometimes Facebook like messes with us, so we get on live a little bit early just to make sure that we're able to get on. So yeah.
Okay, so how do we share the screen though?
So I'm going to allow right now. So if you go, there's a little on the bottom, there's a green thing that says share screen. You see that?
Yeah, look at that.
And you just share screen, and then it's just like a PowerPoint. Then on your screen, you pull up your PowerPoint and then do like the presenter mode or whatever, and it should be good to go. And then I'll change the gallery mode so that you'll have a little, you'll be talking, but you'll be the only one talking while, so when they look, they'll see your little square and then your PowerPoint. And then once you stop sharing, then we'll go back to this mode.
I love that we're doing this right now.
Well, we got 2 minutes.
Okay.
Moderation,
water.
what's that? Yeah.
Oh, he's gonna go get water.
I'm
Excellent.
gonna get some water
Thank you.
because we'll start in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm sharing screen.
Well, we don't want to. Let's wait until I'll introduce you, because if you share a screen, then when people get on, they'll just be looking at the screen. So I'll introduce you at 12, and then I'll invite and introduce Amy, and then that's when you'll share screen. Does that make sense?
So we're really just gonna go with this and hope that tech works. You clearly
you could practice. You could do the sharing screen. How about us practice?
see, now that's more my style. I like practice. Of course, I'm trying to figure out.
Delia, I feel you too. I'm the same way.
Right? Going to get water. What? Okay.
Phil's just done this so many times. He's like, it's all good.
I've been hiding from Zoom in a very big way. Okay. So I share the Microsoft PowerPoint. Is that right?
Yeah, just share your screen. Is it allowing you? It should transition over to your screen.
Oh, should it? It says open system preferences.
So if you click, I mean, if I say share my, it should just go to basic, like,
Do you want me to send it to you?
yeah, if you could send it to me.
Will I be able to see it in presenter mode still?
Yeah. So what is it saying? Is there a little green thing on that says share screen?
Yeah, there's a green button.
And you click that arrow, or you click it, or just click the green box, and then it has desktop. Click that.
Click that. Okay, and it says open system preferences.
Open.
Oh, I see your screen.
Yeah, I don't know why it says open system preferences, because I have you able to. Amy, let's see if you can share.
Okay. Let me make sure there's something cool on my.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Right?
Yeah, I'm like, well, let's see what I got on here.
All right.
Okay.
So what did you do?
So yeah, it says. So did you just see? Do you see mine now?
I do see yours now.
Okay.
All right. I don't know what. All right.
So I wonder.
I don't know what. So yeah, just send it to me.
Okay.
I don't know. So send it to me, and then I'll How about this? Try it now. I'm going to make you the co-host. So now try to share it.
Okay, well, I'm emailing it to you now, but yes, let me go back there to close my email again because we don't want to share that. We want to share the screen, share screen, desktop.
Now, if you click the desktop, then what does it say?
It still wants me to do something. Whoa. Don't want to leave the meeting, right?
Yeah.
Ew.
Yeah, I don't know about this.
All right,
I feel
just
like
send
maybe
it
we
to
should have
me.
practiced.
Yeah, if you just send it to me and then we'll get going.
I did. Did you get
Okay.
it?
I'll check.
This is a really neat idea. You've had some powerful speakers on.
Yeah, we've been it's been pretty
Yeah.
cool. Which email did you send it to?
Oh, I think your school email.
Okay. Okay, I got it.
Okay.
Let me pull it up. All right, we're good to go. I got it. All right. All right. We are live. Thank you. It is now 12:03 and we are on live with the Indigenous Speaker Series. I'm going to play host today as Charlie is not going to make it. He's got class, but I'm glad to have our speaker, Delia Sharpe, on here, as well as one of my colleagues, Amy Matheson. And so we're going to get right started with me introducing Amy, and then I'll introduce Delia. Amy, could you say a few words about yourself?
Hi, my name is Amy Matheson. I am the Family Support Coordinator at Two Feathers. I help run the Making Relatives program, where we do intensive case management with our families. I am new to this position. I recently transitioned to Two Feathers from Humboldt County Child Welfare Services, where I was an investigator and for about a year and a half. And yeah, that's pretty much down low. Humboldt County native, and that's about it.
Thank you. I'm glad to have you on here with the speakers on our speaker series as Two Feathers employee. And now I'm going to turn it over to introduce our speaker, who is Delia Sharpe. She is the founding executive director of the California Tribal Families Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the health, safety, and welfare of tribal children and families, with a focus on increasing compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. She has an extensive history of working within Native communities, and she comes highly referenced or highly promoted by our executive director, Blair Cruiser. And so I am really excited, and I know a lot of our team at Two Feathers, as well as the community in Humboldt County, are excited to hear what you have to say today, which is going to be on the Indian Child Welfare Act. Welcome, Delia.
Thank you. I'll remember to thank Blair later.
Okay. So how we're going to do this today is Delia is going to have a presentation that she's put together about the Indian Child Welfare Act. And then after the presentation, we will have some questions in the audience. Those of you that are tuning in live on Facebook, you can ask questions on the comment section, and I'll look at those questions and then ask Delia if you have any. And I will be pushing and sharing my screen right now so that we can see the presentation, and that will take 1 second. All right, we're ready.
Okay, so, uh-oh, it's moving without me moving it. And I don't have access to it as a presenter mode. Is there a way for me to do that?
I think just let me know to share. If you just kind of, I'll be watching. So if you just kind of look up and say, move the slide, then I'll do that because I don't think there'll be access.
Okay, here, 1 second. I have an idea. I'm having a technical difficulty here because I can't share my screen, but I would like my presenter mode. If I can. Thank you very much for your patience, everybody. So was technology largely worked out in other presentations, Virgil?
Yeah, for the most part, but our Shay, who helps us with this, said that there was an issue around this sharing screens. So I think it was something with Zoom that has they changed. So you have to update it maybe on your computer.
It's also entirely possible that it's something with me. So I apologize for that. But we'll go ahead and get started while I try to open this here on my computer. So yeah, let's talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act. I feel like I should have worn my I Heart ICWA shirt because I love it. It was put together by Season Good Pasture at the Paul Band of Mission Indians. And it sets the stage for the presentation, generally speaking, but on the small screen, it didn't really work so well. But let me go ahead and introduce California Tribal Families Coalition. Virgil, if you could move the screen forward, please. As Virgil said, the mission is to promote and protect the health, safety, and welfare of tribal children and families, which are really inherent tribal governmental functions at the core of tribal sovereignty and tribal governance. And California Tribal Families Coalition is a tribally led membership organization. So we have a board of directors comprised of 13 duly elected tribal officials. Actually, Virgil, your dad, Chairman Moorhead, is my boss as a board member. And we have tribes throughout the state of California that are members of the organization. They join by resolution, really authorizing the coalition to broadly advocate for child welfare. And in addition to having member tribes, we also have the 3 regional chairmen's associations as members. And then we organize regionally to hear what the issues are directly from tribes in those areas. And then we try to work toward kind of local, state, and federal solutions to the issues that we hear about. And CTFC comes directly out of, it's a successor organization to the California ICWA Compliance Task Force. The report that task force created is available on our website, but that task force report contains 20 targeted recommendations. And really the work that we do at the coalition is geared toward implementing those regulations with an intention toward increasing overall ICWA compliance. And we have been able to, largely as the result of having tribes unite around this issue, pass legislation. We passed AB 3176 a couple of years ago now that sort of overhauled the California Welfare and Institutions Code with regard to ICWA compliance. It modified 32 provisions, I want to say, over 30 provisions of the Welfare and Institutions Code to bring it in line with the 2016 Bureau of Indian Affairs regulations. And to also create heightened standards here in California. We've also passed additional legislation and worked on policy guidance to really try to remove barriers to tribal participation in cases. And more recently, we have kind of started to pivot a little bit to really doing more tribal infrastructure development in working toward things like getting more tribes Title IV e-access, right? So that they have the ability to obtain the, that overall important funding source of, child welfare dollars that come from the federal government. And Virgil, if you have questions as we go through here, feel free to interrupt me. I don't have any need to just talk at people for an hour.
Okay.
Okay, so what is ICWA then? Well, ICWA is a statute that was passed by Congress in 1978 in response to the following findings that you see there on your screen. An alarmingly high percentage of Indian families were being broken up by often unwarranted removals of children. There's an alarmingly high percentage of such children being placed in non-Indian foster and adoptive homes and institutions, where they frequently suffered serious adjustment problems during adolescence. And also, what was found at the time is that state courts were failing to recognize what were called essential tribal relations of Indian people and cultural and social standards prevailing in Indian communities and families. So Indian children were being removed under the pretense of neglect, but really, it was sort of a misinterpretation of culture is a very polite way of putting it. Next slide. Okay, so we get questions about, okay, so ICWA was passed in 1978, and we have data, backing the reason why Congress implemented it then, but what about now? Well, here in California, you can see 4 counties listed: Humboldt, Inyo, Del Norte, and Lake. And in those 4 counties, Native American people make up less than 10% of the overall population. However, on any given day in Humboldt County, 1/3 to 50% of the overall children in care are Native American. That number is not much better in Inyo County at 36%, or Del Norte County at 29%, or Lake County at 15%. So yes, the Indian Child Welfare Act continues to be a critical statute protecting Indian children and families. So what is ICWA, right? ICWA is a statute that provides what we call minimum federal standards, and it requires counties to inquire as to whether a child is Native American, and to provide notice to tribes when a child is or may be an Indian child, allowing then the tribe to be able to participate in that child's case, or even to transfer that case to tribal jurisdiction, to tribal court. It requires active efforts to be provided to prevent the removal of the child, right? So before that family is broken up, to actually provide those services. And if a removal becomes necessary, to provide active effort services to reunify that family. It also has basic evidentiary requirements, including testimony by a qualified expert witness to ensure that the removal is appropriate, and then also creates a hierarchy of placement preferences, always looking to place with extended family first. So next slide there. So ICWA was widely considered the gold standard of child welfare. There are at least 17 national child welfare organizations that have come out and said that, not only in the amicus brief that's cited here in Adoptive Couple versus Baby Girl, but also in ongoing litigation that we'll touch on at the end of the presentation here. But why, right? Why is the Indian Child Welfare Act considered the gold standard of child welfare? Well, looking at placement preference, for instance, in 1978, Congress, through the Indian Child Welfare Act, says you should place children with extended family. Only now are we starting to see federal law really moving in that direction. And the state of California has been a bit ahead of that curve. But again, that's where ICWA was in 1978. Looking at active efforts to prevent the breakup of the family, we see that in the recently passed federal law, Families First Prevention Act, right? That's now, right? In 2000, and that was passed in 2017. We're finally catching up with where the Indian Child Welfare Act was in 1978. And, importantly now, we are seeing funding come with that mandate, which is hugely important. But again, the ICWA has been really kind of the gold standard of child welfare going back to the 70s. Next slide. So a quote from Matthew Fletcher: in very meaningful ways, ICWA and state laws are similar. Sorry, I can't read it because you are all on Zoom here. So let me look at it down here. In very meaningful ways, ICWA and state laws are similar. ICWA was designed to protect the best interest of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes. Like state laws, ICWA requires courts to give preferences to family members in foster and permanent placements. Like state laws, ICWA is intended to reunify families whenever possible. Like state laws, ICWA contains similar, if occasionally differing in terms of degree, procedural rights for parents. So again, the state laws and now federal laws are catching up where ICWA has been since the 1970s. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to slow this down just a little bit. And I just want to make it clear as we start to get into kind of the definition of Indian child that this is not a training, right? This is a podcast being live streamed on Facebook, something I never thought that I would do, but here I am. And, really a discussion, I think, of kind of what ICWA is and, what it does from a tribal perspective today, in May of 2020. So the Indian Child Welfare Act defines who is an Indian child, right? And it defines an Indian child as any unmarried person who is age 18 and is either 1, a member of an Indian tribe, or 2, is eligible for membership in an Indian tribe and is the biological child of a member of an Indian tribe, okay? So when you take that definition, you can see very clearly that it is not based on race, right? This federal statute called the Indian Child Welfare Act does not apply to child welfare cases based on race. Instead, tribal membership and tribal citizenship make it a fundamentally political determination, right? Moving one slide next, please. This becomes really important to understand because there's a shared jurisdictional piece that exists, right? So Indian children as citizens of their tribe are under the jurisdiction, for instance, of Humboldt County, where Two Feathers is located, and also the tribe of which they are a member. That creates a requirement, really a mandate, to have a strong partnership between counties and tribes in order to achieve the best interest of the child, right? And county social workers typically have a great deal of discretion with regard to decisions that are being made in a child welfare case, right? And I think one of the rubs that comes in where ICWA applies is that ICWA's minimum federal standards, to some extent, take away some of that discretion. And what happens there is that there is a requirement to consult with the child's Indian tribe and also to do joint decision-making, particularly at the front end of a child welfare case, right? And we have had any number of barriers that have been identified as reasons for that strong partnership not to exist at the beginning of the case. One of the most recent had to do with confidentiality of a case, right, and sharing of records. And so there was legislation passed to change the Welfare and Institutions Code provision to specifically include tribes to allow for that sharing of information. And then it also required the state, through California Department of Social Services, to issue an all-county letter providing additional guidance regarding access to records. So as issues arise, right, as counties identify what they believe to be barriers, tribes are then put in the position of having to kind of identify why, as sovereign entities who are really looking out for their tribal citizen, have a right to that information. And what's really interesting is that it actually links back to tribes being treated as governmental entities, right? That's how legislation is passed for Welfare and Institutions Code 827. That's really the basis of the direction that's provided through the state's all county letters. So it's been in existence all along, right? So a lot of these are artificial barriers that exist largely because there's often, unfortunately, a conflict that exists between counties and tribes on these cases. And that's something that we really need to work hard to undo, and really understanding that a child's connection, an Indian child's connection to his or her tribe is lifelong, right? That it exists well beyond the time that child may be, within an ongoing county child welfare case. And for a county social worker to understand how critical that ongoing relationship is, so that, within, say that, that child welfare case, the county is not actually creating, a difficult relationship between the family and the tribe, right? And just to say that super plainly, we have seen cases where difficult decisions need to be made, and counties essentially throw tribes under the bus, right? That it's the tribe that, is requiring the county to, let's say, remove a child or, not advocate for reunification at a particular point in time, without recognizing that often tribes have more information about that particular family, and that the tribe really is looking out for the best interest of that particular child within the information that they have, which again is often more than what the county has, simply by virtue of that child being a citizen of that tribe and often living on that tribe's reservation or rancheria. Does that make any sense? Okay. Yeah. Are there questions so far? I feel like I'm just talking at myself here in my office.
No, I think everybody's just watching, and maybe we'll, once towards the end, we can do the questions.
Okay, sounds good. So let's go ahead and move on. There we go. So many of you have probably heard about ICWA being under attack, right? I'm not going to go into kind of the underlying issues that we see within those cases, aside from to tell you kind of what's on your screen here, that there are ongoing challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act. No, these are not new. They're really part of an ongoing, unfortunately, very well organized and well-financed campaign, largely, as far as we can tell, being led by the Goldwater Institute, which is a conservative organization based in Arizona, and adoption advocacy organizations. And for several years, they've pursued anti-ICWA litigation kind of across the country. We've seen no less than 13 cases that have been filed. ICWA has survived these challenges, though, including the case that was before the United States Supreme Court in 2013, where the United States Supreme Court declined to rule that ICWA was unconstitutional. And next slide. And this is a quote from Chairman Robert Smith, who is, in addition to being the chairman of the Paula Band of Mission Indians, the chairman of the California Tribal Families Coalition Board of Directors. And what he says is, we know, those of us who are raised in Indian country, those of us who raise our children on the reservations, those of us who know Indian families, ICWA protects our children. This targeted, well-financed attack on ICWA only reminds tribes of the long and tortured history we have endured in the United States. And I think that this quote by Chairman Smith really does a nice job of summarizing, what so many tribes feel as they are having to essentially defend now the Indian Child Welfare Act, which, again, is a statute that's now 40 years old, that has been hailed as the gold standard of child welfare by nearly every national child welfare organization. And so tribes have come together, in making sure that the Indian Child Welfare Act as a federal statute is appropriately defended. And with that, I wanted to make sure that I didn't spend too much time on a PowerPoint so that we could actually have discussion.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy to ask the first question. I know she's did a lot of preparation in the last couple of days, and she's also, a former county social worker. And so I think she offers a great perspective. And I wanted to have her or give her the opportunity for the first question.
Thanks, Virgil. Delia, thank you. That was a great overview of ICWA. I really, even for me, some of those points I was like, oh yeah, right. So it's always useful to revisit. I was thinking about, I have a lot of questions, and I think ICWA just provides such rich dialogue for just really understanding Indigenous communities and tribes and child welfare and our relationship to them and how to do good work. But I guess my first question is, how have you seen ICWA positively impact families, tribal families?
How does ICWA positively impact tribal families?
Yeah, I mean, I know it does, but I'm thinking like, do you have specific examples or situations that you've seen where maybe a child who didn't have connection to his culture or his tribe or her culture or tribe then has connection, or that a family was able to stay supported and connected by their tribe, or things like that?
Yeah, happy to share. Sorry, I am at home with my family, and so it's we are all sharing internet connection. It is fun times, isn't it? No, I would actually love to share a case out of Shasta County that I worked on that was the second tribal customary adoption case that occurred statewide. And without getting too deep into the facts on the case, child was removed from parents. Unfortunately, reunification services were unsuccessful. And the tribe, which was a native village in Alaska, identified relative placement for the child. And we were able to work with Shasta County to develop a very strong relationship between extended family member in Alaska and little girl in Shasta County, so that she could be transitioned to her family in Alaska, where she lives now, very connected both to the native village of Eklutna and the native village of Knik, and where she has been able to grow up. And it's actually been really interesting to be able to watch her grow up through Facebook over the last decade. She's playing on her play structure, and there are elk in her backyard. And to watch her participate, within tribal culture, which would not have been something that she could have done, had she remained, in non-Indian placement in Shasta County.
Thank you.
And, I had a follow-up to one of your slides, and just, I think in educating our community and educating those that may not be that familiar with ICWA, I'm wondering, like, what's at stake besides just the sort of individual family and the child when institutions such as Goldwater and those more sort of hyper conservative think tanks go after ICWA? Like, what is at stake? And when they go after ICWA, that may not just be, the child and the family. Like, what else is at stake?
Yeah, so hugely important question. The arguments being made in the anti-ICWA litigation are that the Indian Child Welfare Act is unconstitutional as a race-based statute. What that does is it raises equal protection issues, right? That essentially, all of federal law is based on the fact that tribes as sovereign entities have a political relationship with the federal government, right? If that is found not to be the case in a statute such as the Indian Child Welfare Act, and instead, there's a reliance on race, then suddenly you have the potential to undo, much of Title 25, all of federal Indian law. So, we do not see really the attacks on ICWA as child welfare cases anymore. There was a quote from Matthew Fletcher that talked about the Brackeen versus Zinke case coming out of the Northern District of Texas, as really being kind of the pivotal case, of the 21st century. And we see tribes giving the weight that case deserves. We saw 107 of California's 109 tribes sign on to the tribal amicus brief at the Fifth Circuit in that case. Tribes that worked very closely with the California Attorney General's office. And they put together a beautiful amicus brief in support of the Indian Child Welfare Act on behalf of state attorneys general. In fact, we had more than half of all the states in the United States join on to that brief. And so there's a tremendous campaign to continue to defend ICWA, but it is very clear that the attacks on ICWA are not attacks on ICWA because of the best interest of Indian children, that it's an attack on tribes.
So if I got correctly what you said, attack on tribes, is that mean attack on sovereignty, attack on the whole idea or that we are nations and that we have our own land, our own systems, our own ways of being? Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying. Well said, Virgil Moorhead.
Thank you. So I guess one thing, because part of the speaker series is us, providing education and information and just raising awareness and support around Indian issues such as ICWA. And so I guess one more follow-up that I had with your presentation is, like, if there's a social worker that is working within Native communities, what would be the specific ways that they can be helpful to tribal nations? Like, what on the ground, what would you recommend, coming from more the legal standpoint and also just in your extensive history of working with tribes in California? What would you tell them that they can do or maybe should do to be a helpful ally or a good social worker for the tribes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that we're talking about how a county social worker can work closely with tribes in the best interest of Indian children, right?
Or even nonprofits such as Two Feathers and United Indian Health Service or others, not just the county.
Yeah, in my experience, and my experience only comes from me being a lawyer because that's what I am, but it requires communication early on in a case, right? That it's so important that when a family is, even on the radar at the county level, that the county is reaching out to the tribe so that relationship can initially be built. And so that there can start to be a joint understanding of how that case might proceed, right? So, certainly prior to removal, there should be, a tremendous focus on what services can we put in place so that a removal does not become necessary, right? And, for counties to be able to utilize all the legal avenues that are available to them. And unfortunately, so many of our counties in California don't do that, right? We have counties in California that do not utilize, for instance, voluntary placement agreements that would allow a parent to go to inpatient rehab and provide funding to a caregiver, right? That right now, if a county is not utilizing a voluntary placement agreement, certainly that parent can go to rehab, but they are relying on the goodwill of somebody to take care of that child, which is a tremendous financial burden, right? Kids are expensive. You and I know that. I mean, that's just the reality. So for counties not to provide that as an option is a real problem. I think that where counties and tribes and kind of everybody who works together, around a family, right? Looking at kind of the wraparound or child and family teaming models, really trying to identify, initially how you support the family, but also not losing focus on the fact that a removal may become necessary. And if a removal becomes necessary, what does that plan look like? right? Because if you're not looking at, where are we going to place this child, you may well have a child that ends up in, what is often called stranger care, right? Simply because, there wasn't that sort of concurrent planning that allowed for, the home study to occur, the criminal background check to occur, and really just for everybody to sort of scramble and try to figure out, who is the best placement for this child? And if necessary, to start to build that relationship, right? That you always want to have a focus on building community around a child. And so you can't just simply focus, even pre-removal, on, parents and the child. There always has to be, I think, an eye toward, what comes next if we're unsuccessful here, because that's really, how you protect a child. But that requires coordination and collaboration and joint decision making,
Makes sense. And so before I turn over another question for Amy, I'm going to take one from our audience. And so, and it's kind of a similar question, but it's what can county managers and supervisors do to implement or that allow for their social workers to do a good job? So taking it maybe so much from or taking it from like the ground at the social work level into more the systemic sort of managerial administrative level.
Yeah. There's a lot of misinformation about the Indian Child Welfare Act that floats around out there, right? That it really only takes, one case where bad relationships are established to kind of set the tone and impact the culture of a, county child welfare organization. And I think that supervisors have to find a way to ensure that that doesn't happen. Right. And, we have recommended things like, having county social workers, regularly, visit rancherias, reservations, maintain close relationships. But really, I think two things are fundamental. One is having key social workers, sort of line social workers that are assigned to either all cases with regard to a tribe or a region, so that those relationships can be built, right, between the social worker that will actually be kind of on the ground, working with the tribe, around that particular family and child. And if the tribe starts to have a problem with that social worker and requests, a reassignment, that, that be given due weight, right? That it's not in the best interest of the child to have a situation where you have, let's just call it a personality conflict, right? You need the county and the tribe to be working together. But the other fundamental there, outside of having, that relationship piece between the tribal social worker and the county social worker that are actually assigned, is having supervisors that, one, really understand what the law is, understand what their internal policies are aware of any protocols that exist between the county and the tribe, and that really closely are engaged with their social workers' cases, right? That it cannot simply be, kind of a trust of what's going on, right? Because it's impossible, in my experience, to train every county social worker to the extent that, they really understand the nuances of the Indian Child Welfare Act, right? Particularly in counties where you just don't have those existing relationships between your county social workers and your tribal social workers. Where you do, things start to turn around pretty quickly. But where that doesn't exist, you need your supervisors to really be monitoring how that case is going. And you need supervisors, I think, to require that where there's conflict between the county social worker and the tribal social worker on any issue, for that conflict to trickle up immediately, that should not be the burden of the tribe to sort of be escalating that issue, right? That county social worker should be taking that to the supervisor, and the supervisor should be reaching out to the tribe immediately. The longer we get into any sort of disagreement, the more difficult it is to unravel. And, that always plays out as overall impact to the child and the family, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. It seems like a very important point. And so is there like examples? I know you've have a history of working in Humboldt County, and but just in your work in general, are there examples where you've seen that play out in a good way, just to as a way to really sort of hammer down the importance of, I think, what you just talked about?
In a good way. No kidding. Let's see. I don't have a specific case that I can recall. But yeah, I mean, we have had situations where, we have a tribal social worker that's been able to work with a particular county social worker that seems to, understand the relationship piece. And as a result of that, there's joint decision-making that occurs, right? And so when you're in, what is now called, CFT, a child and family team meeting, everybody's on the same page, right? And it's only then, and when I say everybody, I really mean, at least the county and the tribal social worker, right? Kind of the decision makers of the case. Because it's only then that you can really get at, the idea of child voice and choice, right? That if you have entities that are decision makers that are having conflict within those team meetings, it's very difficult to get to the place where you are really hearing what a child and, the child's family needs or wants within that.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy to ask another question.
Delia, I feel like I really appreciate what you've been sharing, and I think you're just hammering home the importance of relationships and relationships between, county and tribes, relationships between tribal social workers and county social workers, relationships with family. I mean, the work that we're doing is, it's inherently relational. And so building on those relationships, healing them, working harder to establish them, I think is so important. And I appreciate that as a non-Native individual who's worked in child welfare, but is also working for a Native organization now. It's just something to continually consider and think about. And one thing that I appreciate about Two Feathers and the staff and the work that we're doing is, I think that we're continually trying to imagine different types of systems that can work with our families and our community, and specifically for us, mental health systems, but all different kinds, and thinking about what does decolonized work mean within those systems. And as I was researching ICWA more and thinking about it, I was thinking about it as really a decolonizing law, as a decolonizing practice that your organization is going into spaces that are deeply entrenched in colonization and bureaucracy, and you are doing decolonizing work. And so I was wondering if you could speak to maybe what that means to you, and how we can think about decolonizing child welfare and other social work.
Well, also as a non-Native person who works within the tribal community, I actually started working in the tribal community there in Humboldt, through Humboldt State University, in developing an archive for Taloa. But decolonizing, I'm going to be very clear. I'm not going to answer this question directly. Instead, what I'm going to say is this. I'm actually going to take it back a second, because I have been doing a lot of talking about relationships, right? And I think relationships are hugely important. But anybody that knows me knows that I firmly believe that child welfare and the best interest of a child cannot hinge on relationships, that counties have to be held to all of the child welfare laws that exist, right? There has to be enforcement of those laws. And unfortunately, what happens, and the reason that I kind of wanted to slow this down and go back and address this, is that I think that there becomes almost a shifting of the burden to tribes, right? In terms of trying to ensure compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. And the reality is that the burden, if we're going to call it a burden, of complying with the Indian Child Welfare Act falls squarely on state courts and state agencies. That the Indian Child Welfare Act has to be followed even where a tribe is not able to intervene or participate in a case. So just wanted to be very, very clear about that part of it, right? And that, that's important to understand kind of throughout, that even where the tribe is a party to the case, the tribe may not be able to kind of participate at the level that the county may want, right? So you want to partner in these cases, but we have 109 tribes within the state of California. Each of those tribes is very different from one another, right? Both in terms of number of tribal members and overall economic development. And so what one tribe may be able to offer, another tribe may not, right? So again, ICWA compliance is not does not fall on the shoulders of the tribe. That's a requirement of the state courts and state agencies. In terms of your question about decolonizing, I think that really goes to where we are starting to really focus the work of the California Tribal Families Coalition, which is on tribal infrastructure development. Working with tribes to develop systems that allow them to access Title IV-B and Title IV-E child welfare funding that start to really allow tribes to move these cases, from state court jurisdiction into tribal jurisdiction. And there are other states that are much sort of farther ahead of where we're sort of in general here in California, mostly because of funding. Right, we have other states that kind of do a better job of sharing some of that funding. By that funding, I mean child welfare funding with tribes on a proportional basis. And without getting into a big discussion of jurisdiction, where the state is not a PL 280 concurrent jurisdiction state, right, where there's not kind of an already very muddy framework around what jurisdiction looks like. But that's where tribes, I think, want to go. And I think that's where tribes need to go in order for, really, one, us to start seeing ICWA compliance, and two, for tribes to be able to exercise tribal sovereignty over domestic tribal relations in the way that tribes want to.
So I'm going to turn it back to the audience, and there's a question from Camellia Lovestar. And her question is, do you have any recommendations in regards to how CWS social workers and our tribal partners share information better? It really struck me when you said the tribes hold additional information about the family. And I feel it's the same from the CWS end. I feel like we need more communication and more transparency from both sides. So recommendations on that particular topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is particularly important at the front end of a case, right? Where decisions are being made about whether removal is necessary or not. We recently, in the last 6 months, got guidance from the state of California through, again, an all-county letter. It's titled Tribal Access to Records, that I think really clarifies that all records, and with regard to a child welfare case, outside of specific criminal background records, should be shared with a tribe. So that would include, for instance, the initial referral and all of the information that the county was able to gather on that intake. And that, and I think that this is, as I understand, starting to happen. That the tribe and the county should be able to sit down and start to look at, what is the next right step in that particular case, whether that is, a move toward investigation, or, the decision kind of moving from investigation to providing, services and keeping a child in a home, or if removal becomes necessary.
And I guess, we have a couple more questions, but I have a question. And I'm just curious, what is it that got you personally sort of in this this work and just being such a fierce advocate and fighter for Indian rights broadly, and more specifically, the ICWA and the importance of keeping children in their families?
Yeah, I'll tell you, my passion was environmental justice. And I was as a graduate student at Humboldt State University, and a professor asked me if I would assist in developing a tribal archive for the then Smith River Rancheria, now the Tallahwa Dene Nation. And in doing that work and learning about the history of that tribe and the injustice that occurred when essentially their reservation was sort of shrunk as a result of federal government policy, and then continuing to learn about, the just decades of injustice that tribes had suffered, there was just no way to go anywhere else with my career. And children are the future. They're the future for, sort of in general, and certainly they're the future of tribes. And so, if there's not a protection, of children, and if troubled children are lost, then I don't know how you undo any other injustice that tribes face.
Thank you. And so I'm seeing that there's a question from Elizabeth McClure. And what she says is, how do we advocate for a federal agency to designate to oversee the implementation of ICWA to ensure states comply with the law? Is there any sense of federal data compiled to show the results of the compliance since the law's passage?
Wow, hits on data in the question. Excellent. No, we do not have any concrete data. We have actually been pushing for data through something called the AFCARs, which is essentially like an enormous data set that states have to compile and then send back to the federal government a couple of times every year. We've been trying to get ICWA-related data points within that. We're actually successful back in 2016. And then as the Trump administration came into power, we have seen those regulations shift. And we actually expected to see the new regulations, which dramatically impacted in a very negative way those ICWA-related data points, come out today. Haven't seen them yet, though, so probably next week. What I can tell you is that the state of California is actually very supportive of collecting data with regard to ICWA compliance. And so in 2016, we had a rule that said that we would have, I want to say 67 ICWA-related data points within, this overall data set called the AFCARs. What we're looking at from a federal regulatory perspective now is something much, much less. I want to say it's 10. But the state of California, within the development of its new child welfare case management structure, is going to continue to find a way to include, all what I'm calling 67, but I think it's closer to 70.
Nice. I have to say, thank you for that. I also have to say that, I've been doing the speaker series for the last month, and this is the most questions that we've got from the audience. So this is a hot topic. So sorry if I'm a little bit distracted because we're getting so many questions. But this one is from a lucky person, a real special person, disguised as Blake. But this question, or Beal, can you share some of the obstacle tribes face in advocating under ICWA for the protection of Indian children? And what are some of the current advocacy efforts of your agency to address these barriers? So in other words, this question is from Blair, and she's wondering, can you share some of the obstacles that tribes face for in addressing ICWA, and then also what are the things that you're doing at your agency?
Yeah. So the primary barrier to ICWA compliance is a lack of enforcement, right? That Congress passes, this law that I think, most reasonable people can look at and identify as the gold standard of child welfare. But it doesn't include teeth, right? So it makes it very difficult to get to a point that we would call compliance. We back in 2015 at the ICWA conference at Grayton, there was a discussion that occurred with a newly formed Bureau of Children's Justice within the California Department of Justice about, looking at ICWA compliance. There's still a lot of hope that we will, start to see, enforcement action taken with regard to ICWA in that way. But it's really difficult because tribes lack funding, right? And with a lack of funding comes, the inability to have very developed tribal infrastructure, including tribal courts. So taking cases into tribal jurisdiction is not always an option. Not having tribal attorneys in the courtroom on these cases is a tremendous obstacle to ICWA compliance. Right now in a state court child welfare case, you have the child represented by legal counsel, you have the county represented by legal counsel, you have mom represented and dad represented. So lots of lawyers in the courtroom. And then you have the tribe with full party standing, often represented by a tribal social worker. That is not a level playing field, right? It is just simply not. So, one of the advocacy efforts that we have really been moving toward is the development of a panel of attorneys that would do nothing but represent tribes in child welfare matters. But there is no federal funding source that clearly allows for funding of such a thing. We had a bill, AB 685, in the California legislature this year with a $10 million budget ask to be able to start a pilot project in 4 separate counties. And now we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic and, a state facing, instead of a $22 million surplus, an enormous deficit. So we will not see that happen this year. Instead, what we are going to do and what we started doing is looking at alternate options, right? Can we identify tribal funding sources that if we pull together, we can start to fund, at least on, a semi-regional basis, lawyers that can represent tribes. Because really, until you level that playing field in the courtroom, it's going to be very, very difficult to see ICWA compliance, because that at the moment is the only sort of enforcement that we really have.
Makes sense. And to pivot a little bit from sort of the importance of legal, which I don't think that it's not correlated, but to this question, but there's a question from the audience by Natalie Soder. And she said, can you talk a little bit about active efforts and also how they can differ across tribes?
Yeah, active efforts are services that are supposed to be provided to a family, right? As we've talked about, initially to prevent the breakup of the family. If that's not successful, then to reunify a family. It's supposed to be something more than, what are usually called the sort of mere reasonable efforts that are required under state law for cases not involving Indian children. Those services, those active effort services, are supposed to actually be provided, on a case-by-case basis, taking into consideration the cultural standards of a particular tribe. So they are not supposed to be cookie cutter in nature. They should be developed in coordination with the tribe. They should utilize the prevailing social and cultural resources of that particular tribe. We've actually really been trying to push counties to work with tribes to develop services where culturally appropriate services currently don't exist. And the theory goes something like this. If you have, let's say like in Humboldt County, and I'm just going to use a low number, let's say 30% of the overall children in care as being Native American, then it would seem reasonable that 30% of your overall services are targeted at the Native American population, right? So if that doesn't exist, I think that the burden falls to the county to figure out how it works with its tribal partners, right? Either the tribes directly or tribal organizations such as Two Feathers, to develop those services, right? How do you start, being cognizant as a county of the fact that right now federal funding for child welfare comes almost exclusively to states and then flows down to counties, but does not go to tribes, right? Because right now, most of our cases involving Indian children are within the state court system, but you have to provide these services under federal law that are supposed to be culturally appropriate. If you don't have them in your county, counties should be figuring out how to create them.
Well said. Well, our audience is continuing to ask questions, so we have a little bit of time left. So I'm going to ask one more, and this is from Jessica Goodrow, and she says, as a tribal advocate and ICWA reps or tribal leaders in Indian communities, what would you want new judges of dependency to know about working with sovereign nations? How do you give judges native perspectives without being a lawyer?
I feel where Jessica is coming from. I think so often in cases where ICWA applies, tribal representatives, whether they be social workers or lawyers, find themselves in a position in the courtroom of educating judges about the requirements of the Indian Child Welfare Act. How do you do that? Ideally, you do that before you're standing in a courtroom on an individual case, right? And I think that Mendocino County, well, I actually don't know if they do it anymore, but there used to be a roundtable that judges participate in. And so starting that dialogue before you're in the courtroom, I think is really helpful. Kind of trying to answer that question more directly, I would actually use the testimony of a qualified expert witness, right? I would put that person on the stand, with the idea being that that person is really there to provide the appropriate lens for that case, right? So, allowing that qualified expert witness to testify to the tribe's social and cultural standards, to allow that qualified expert witness to even talk about the history of the tribe and why the history of the tribe may be playing into, the intergenerational trauma that I think tribal social workers are, very versed in, but, often doesn't come out in the courtroom. So utilizing, that legal option to be able to essentially tell a story and set the stage for, kind of the rest of the legal arguments that might take place around that family.
That makes sense. And one follow-up, or a little bit, actually, it's not a follow-up, it's a different question, but very interesting, by Vanessa Esquivo. I know my tribe uses ICWA, but we are not federally recognized. Do you think the numbers of Native children being removed from our families are even more severe or great?
Being removed from families of non-federally recognized tribes or in general?
The non-recognized status of tribes that are non-recognized, that I think the question is getting at that, and maybe how is your work, or what are your thoughts around federally recognized tribes?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, the minimum federal standards, of ICWA don't necessarily apply to a case involving a child who's a member of a non-federally recognized tribe, right? Kind of going back to that discussion that we had earlier about, ICWA being based on this political relationship between, a tribe and the federal government, and that doesn't exist with regard to a non-federally recognized tribe. Of course, the difficulty here, particularly in California, is as a result of federal government policies, or largely as a result of those policies anyway. We have many tribes that lack federal recognition, right? So, there is a provision in the California Welfare and Institutions Code that allows for those tribes to, quote, participate in a child welfare case involving, a member of their tribe at the discretion of the juvenile court judge, right? So certainly not the same, kind of level of party rights that a tribe would have. And I think that's really unfortunate, because those tribes, whether federally recognized or not, can still provide, a tremendous number of services to that family. And like we talked about before, that connection between that child and that tribe will continue to, go on long after the child welfare case is done. So if we're looking at the case from a common sense perspective or a resiliency perspective, doesn't it make sense, for that tribe to be involved? I think there are really strong arguments to be made along those lines. But again, that's sort of outside of the application of the Indian Child Welfare Act, unfortunately. In terms of data, we don't have good data on, in fact, we don't really have any data on the number of ICWA cases that exist in the state of California. We have cases, we have data that I wouldn't trust on the number of cases that include a person that identifies as being Native American. And that would, you would think include, people that were members of non-federally recognized tribes, but honestly, that data is not to be trusted. And we need to move in a direction that it is, though, because as you know, working for a nonprofit, and tribes well know, because the funding mechanisms are all tied to it, until we have solid data, it is really difficult to ever, expect that we are going to see tribes adequately funded for child welfare or any other service that a tribe is providing.
Thank you. And so that makes sense. And, we're going to have one more question. And so I'm going to put the pressure on our new co-host for today, Amy. She has a question, but I think it's going to speak a little bit to your last point about systems. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do at Two Feathers is have a strong emphasis, even in mental health, on systems and not just individualized, often social, sort of historical, political violence, right, against Indigenous people. And so, Amy, there's not pressure, but you have the last question.
Okay, well, thanks for putting the pressure on, Virgil. Yeah, I was thinking about conversations around systems, and then about the disproportionate number of Native American children in the child welfare system. And that's a direct result of colonization, the effects of colonization, historical trauma and ongoing trauma to our Indigenous communities. And with that in mind, how do we do a better job of focusing on these systems of oppression and changing these larger systems rather than on the individual so-called choices that our tribal families, parents, kids may be making?
Well, it's difficult because you're working within, such enormous constructs, right? I mean, the child welfare system is enormous. And, I was just, reading data again that I found really shocking, which is that at least 30% of all children will at some point have had a referral made against them, right? So at least 30% of all kids, not just Native American, but all kids across the country will at some point have had a referral made against them. So it's just an enormous system to be working in general. I think, unfortunately, ICWA is often not thought about when system changes are occurring, right? So one of the things that we're seeing is that, for instance, to make this more concrete in nature, there was a Family First Preservation Services Act that was passed, right? So federal law, the state now has to implement this federal law. And so, we're seeing changes being made to the Welfare and Institutions Code. But in really trying to look at, okay, so how does implementing this new federal law into state law impact ICWA compliance? It's an enormous undertaking, right? And, that's true for every law that's passed, right? And every policy that's developed, because the reality is that, the Indian Child Welfare Act kind of overlays on top of state child welfare law and policy. So there's no single piece of, state child welfare law or policy that you can carve out as sort of not applying to an Indian child's case, right? So, it becomes kind of a, just enormous effort to try to make sure that, as laws are changing, that, there continues to be an eye toward, how do we make this work for tribes? And within that, often what, we try to talk about is, if tribal social workers can really kind of be focused on, the issues happening within that particular case, that's helpful. And then beyond that, looking at developing tribal infrastructure that really allows tribes to be able to provide services without such a reliance on counties. And, I just want to add one thing because I haven't mentioned it here, and it feels like we might be kind of wrapping up. And there was a bill that was passed last year, AB 175, and it's called the Foster Care Bill of Rights. And well, I'm not going to get into the whole history of it, even though I'd like to, because it actually did a really nice job of interfacing with tribal youth and the development of it. But that's a story for another time. You probably want to take a look at it. It does a really nice job of identifying what are those sort of basic rights that an Indian child in the foster care system should have. And they include an ongoing connection to the child's tribe. And we didn't see that in law before. It also includes things like the child's attorney should actually be versed in the Indian Child Welfare Act. But I wanted to mention it in particular to this audience because I haven't seen a lot of information out there about it, but I think that it's actually a really strong advocacy tool.
Thank you. I'll have to check that out as well as Amy and our other team. Maybe that could be a teaching tool for us at Two Feathers. So I just wanted to thank you again for getting on our speaker series. And I think it's been well received. There's still questions that we have not got to, but thank you again. And for those of you that have been tuning in on the speaker series, Two Feathers Virtual Indigenous Speaker Series, we'll be back at it on Monday with the great educator Pedro Nogueira. I'm really looking forward to that. That'll be at 12 o'clock. And we have a whole other series the rest of the week that speakers. And so thank you for tuning in. And thank you again, Delia. Do you have any last words that you'd like to tell our audience?
Really, thank you so much, Virgil. Keep up the good work up there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.